70 years ago in the state of Illinois, an 11-year-old boy named Henry Porter disappeared from his familiar neighborhood, leaving no clear traces behind, plunging his family into panic and despair. Authorities quickly got involved but treated it as a typical case of a child wandering off. When the search yielded no results, leads dried up, and the file eventually stalled. Yet over the many decades that followed, the question of Henry's fate never truly vanished, quietly lingering in dusty case files and the memories of those still alive. Then one day, from a detail that seemed completely unrelated to the 1955 disappearance, an unexpected discovery emerged, forcing the entire story to be re-examined from the beginning, in a way no one could have foreseen. Before diving deeper into this particular case, let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next cold case stories. Illinois in 1955 still bore the strong marks of the post-World War II era, a time when faith in social order and community safety was almost taken for granted by most Midwestern working families, where children could walk to school alone, go to the library, or play in the park without adult supervision. And small neighborhoods like those in Peoria operated on familiarity and mutual trust, rather than vigilance. In that context, the Porter family lived a truly quiet life, not affluent but stable, with the father working fixed-shift technical jobs and the mother managing the household, caring for the children according to a regular daily routine, where dinner had fixed times, weekends were for church, and small community activities. Henry Porter, their 11-year-old son, was a familiar part of that rhythm, a boy old enough to be trusted with simple errands, like borrowing books from the public library alone, running nearby chores, or delivering messages to neighbors, with a skinny build, hair cut short in the typical schoolboy style of the time. Polite speech habits and an early independence formed in a society that saw it as normal. Henry wasn't a standout child in any special way, but he was closely bonded to his family, especially visible to relatives in daily activities, bonds built from the repetition of similar mornings and familiar paths leading home. The day Henry disappeared started no differently from any before it, with familiar activities unfolding in their usual order, no warning signs of an impending disruption, and it was precisely that normality that made initial unusual details seem faint when they appeared. Along the route Henry traveled that day, an off-kilter situation emerged, in the form of an approach that wasn't entirely unfamiliar, but also not familiar enough to create absolute safety, a moment that put the boy in a brief state of hesitation between following the habits he'd been taught and responding with the innate trust of a child raised in an environment with few danger warnings. Those vague signals, in the eyes of adults at the time, weren't enough to trigger immediate intervention, as they didn't carry the appearance of violence, caused no disturbance, and weren't accompanied by any sounds or actions that could be seen as urgent. The time when Henry left the sight of family members happened quickly and quietly, leaving no clear boundary between before and after, just an initial absence explained by familiar assumptions, like being later than usual, or stopping somewhere on the way home. When the waiting stretched longer than expected, the family began to realize that the normal was sliding into abnormal, and their first response wasn't panic, but spontaneous searching, asking neighbors, calling Henry's name along familiar routes, repeating habits that had once been enough to bring him back in minor delays before. Those around them provided scattered information, not entirely matching, each detail lacking a decisive element to connect into a clear picture, causing time to continue passing in a tense state of waiting, but still with hope. Only when familiar assumptions collapsed one by one, and Henry's absence could no longer be explained by ordinary reasons, did the Porter family decide to contact the police, marking the moment when an ordinary day in Illinois, in 1955, officially ended, and Henry Porter's disappearance was confirmed as an event beyond the family's and surrounding community's ability to resolve on their own. The Porter family's call to the Peoria Police Department was received in a context where authorities were still accustomed to handling cases of children wandering off or coming home late, rather than criminal disappearances, and right from the initial minutes, Henry Porter's case was recorded according to standard administrative procedures for a missing juvenile. A missing person file was created with basic information about identity, age, home address, physical description, and last seen time, all handwritten on paper forms, reflecting how the investigative system of that era operated on physical disconnected records rather than any centralized database. Assigning an investigator happened quickly, but without high urgency, as the initial assessment didn't place the case in a special risk category, and responsibility was given to an officer familiar with routine missing child cases in the area, whose task was to gather information while assessing whether the case needed expanded resources. In the first hours after the file was opened, police conducted interviews with the Porter family to determine the circumstances before Henry's disappearance, focusing on daily routines, family, and community relationships, as well as any signs of conflict or behavioral changes that might suggest the boy left voluntarily. Questions revolved around when Henry left home, usual routes, familiar locations, and the list of people who might have contacted him that day, aiming to build an overall picture sufficient to rule out the most common hypotheses. Parallel to the family, initial witnesses were also approached shortly after the report, mainly neighbors, acquaintances, and individuals living along Henry's usual paths, but the information gathered was scattered, lacking consistency in timing and details, reflecting the inherent limitations of human memory when recreating events that seemed unremarkable in an ordinary day. Based on these statements, police began narrowing the disappearance timeframe, estimating the period from when Henry left family sight until his absence was noticed, while identifying the key geographic area around familiar routes and places he might have stopped habitually. Location narrowing was done according to the common logic of that era, prioritizing areas near home, where children often played or passed, without yet expanding to more complex scenarios involving travel out of the area, by vehicle or stranger intervention. The initial investigative assessment formed from the combination of social context, family profile, and witness information, leading to a temporary conclusion that the case most likely belonged to the category of children getting lost, delayed, or briefly leaving the area voluntarily. A common assumption in the 1950s, when the concept of child abduction by strangers wasn't seen as a constant threat. This assessment directly influenced the pace and direction of subsequent steps, as it shaped how police allocated resources, the level of urgency in actions, and the scope of investigation considered reasonable in the early phase. While the Porter family began entering a state of increasing anxiety, the investigative system at the time still operated under familiar patterns, where initial decisions were based on experience with similar prior cases, rather than assuming an unusual incident, and Henry Porter's file, though officially opened, remained within the bounds of a disappearance expected to be resolved soon without needing extraordinary investigative measures. After the initial assessment failed to yield quick answers as hoped, the investigative team was forced to move to the most important step of the early phase, reconstructing the timeline as specifically as possible, starting by determining Henry's usual route and the likely route on the day he disappeared. Investigators gathered from the family information about Henry's habits on normal days, the paths he often chose to familiar locations, any stops he usually made, the walking speed of an 11-year-old alone, and factors that might cause him to change route like weather, sudden errands, or unexpected requests from adults. This data was placed on a paper map of the neighborhood, routes redrawn in pencil, with estimated travel times between points, forming an initial hypothetical framework to compare with statements. From that framework, police began building a sequence of time markers by cross-referencing each individual source, family recalling when Henry left home, or a specific activity, neighbors remembering seeing him on the sidewalk, or near an intersection, an acquaintance recalling him near a small store or public area. And these statements arranged chronologically, based on fixed anchors, adults often relied on like meal times, shift ends, church bells, or radio broadcast times. However, when placing the statements on the same timeline, inconsistencies emerged clearly. Some witnesses claimed to see Henry earlier than the family believed he left, others said later than reasonable, if he took a direct route home, and many accounts used vague descriptions like before dinner or around late afternoon, that greatly reduced accuracy. Investigators had to meticulously revisit each witness, asking them to reconfirm times by linking to personal habits, what they were doing at that moment, what program they just heard on the radio, what task they just finished, or who they just met, to turn a vague memory into a clearer time range. Gradually, a relatively consistent sequence of markers was established, but instead of creating a seamless straight line, it created a gap, the critical time period no statement covered with certainty, also the decisive period where Henry went, and what happened to him. That gap wasn't just a number on paper, it was the foggy zone where every hypothesis could exist, from Henry turning off onto another path himself, being approached and led away by someone, to being taken in a vehicle out of the area before anyone noticed. To narrow this gap, police focused on the last point, with relatively high reliability, the area where Henry was last seen, where at least one or two statements overlapped in space though not entirely in time. Investigators marked that area as a node on the map, a street intersection, a corner, an entrance to a residential area, or a transition zone between busy and sparse spots, then conducted field observations of geography and sightlines, what obstacles allowed approach without notice, which turns were hidden, what spaces allowed stopping a vehicle for seconds without attention, and what blind spots might cause witnesses to see only part of the events. They also examined the area's daily rhythm in the suspected time frame, when streets were busy, when quiet, when children usually traveled, when adults returned from work, everyday activities that could mask an unusual event, like vehicle sounds, door slams, or calls. However, without cameras or objective records, the entire analysis still relied on statement reliability and logical inference from context, making any small input error potentially shift the whole timeline. In the cross-referencing process, some minor details initially undervalued began emerging as troubling pieces, a witness casually mentioning a strange vehicle in the area during the corresponding time frame, but without noting the license plate. Someone saying they saw Henry pause as if listening to someone, but not seeing it as report-worthy. A statement mentioning an adult, looking normal, walking near Henry for a few steps, details easily overlooked in a community where everything normal was assumed safe. Investigators of that era, prioritizing clear signs like violence or coercion, tended to treat these vague details as noise, as they weren't enough to turn into specific investigative actions. No identification, no plate, no distinctive description, no clear direction. Some other details were downplayed because they came scattered from witnesses not considered good, providers unsure of time, changing descriptions, or remembering only parts. This lack of stability meant potentially useful information bits weren't connected into a line, but set aside as secondary compared to common hypotheses like getting lost. Parallel to timeline construction, police also tried to determine Henry's normal rhythm for deviation signs. Did he ever turn onto other routes voluntarily? Did he habitually talk to strangers? Had he accepted help from non-family adults? Were their destinations appealing enough to stop? And were there locals regularly contacting children legally, like delivery, repair, or community work? These questions aimed to turn a normal day into a verifiable behavior chain, but they hit limits from how people viewed Henry, a good familiar, low-trouble child, meaning few paid close attention to his minor daily actions. Ultimately, after multiple cross-checks and adjustments, the reconstructed timeline still contained an unfilled foggy gap, with no direct evidence, and that was the point forcing investigators to admit that determining Henry's travel route wasn't just redrawing a path, but tracing a brief moment where a decision, a word, or an approach seeming harmless, bent his life off its everyday trajectory. In that temporary picture, the last seen area became the key point, the critical time gap became the target to narrow, and the undervalued details, because too normal to suspect, began appearing as the only signs that Henry might not have left voluntarily, but was taken out of the community's sight, in a quick, quiet way, almost without clear traces in the decisive early hours of the disappearance. The critical time gap identified during the rapid timeline reconstruction quickly became the factor that forced authorities to shift their focus from analytical reasoning to field action, as any hypothesis at this point could not advance further without additional physical evidence or direct signs from the surrounding environment. The decision to organize a widespread search emerged from a combination of mounting pressure from the Porter family, attention from the local community, and the clear realization that the area Henry might have passed through was far broader than what initial statements described. The Peoria police determined that continuing to narrow down areas on paper would only prolong the deadlock, while a field search campaign, though costly in manpower and difficult to control, remained the most viable path to uncovering any remaining clues in those decisive early days. Mobilization of forces followed the familiar model of Midwestern towns in that era, where police acted as coordinators and the community became a natural extension of the search effort, as local residents were considered to know every alley, trail, and vacant lot better than anyone else. Religious organizations, schools, and neighborhood groups quickly joined, turning the search into a collective activity that was spontaneous yet relatively organized, with the shared belief that a large presence would increase the chances of spotting traces that a small professional team might overlook. To avoid overlapping searches or completely missing an area, police divided the territory based on area maps, prioritizing routes identified in the reconstructed timeline, public places Henry frequently visited, and areas likely to attract a child if he deviated from his usual path. Each search group was assigned a specific zone, along with general instructions on what signs to look for, from personal items and clothing to anything that seemed out of place in the environment, but recording and reporting results still largely depended on the memory and diligence of each group, as there was no standardized system for documenting searches at the scene. During the sweeping of designated areas, some items believed to be related to Henry began to appear, not concentrated in one spot but scattered across areas that were part of his familiar route, making their directional value ambiguous. Each discovery was brought back for comparison with the family to confirm relevance, but uncertainty about whether the item was actually carried by Henry on the day of his disappearance meant they only served as supplementary information rather than decisive evidence. Evaluating these items put investigators in a dilemma. If treated as signs that Henry had passed through that area during the critical time, the timeline would need adjustment. If viewed as unrelated objects, or ones present from before, the entire search effort in that area could be deemed wasted. Alongside specific finds, the search scope increasingly revealed a structural issue. If Henry had deviated from his expected route for just a few minutes, the area to cover would expand rapidly beyond the control capacity of available forces. This forced police to continually reassess the priority of each area, choosing between returning to more thoroughly checked preliminarily searched places or expanding to farther zones with less inferential basis. These decisions were not made in a vacuum, but were directly influenced by available resources, participant fatigue, and diminishing belief that the search would yield results without a clear new lead. Reports from search groups, when compiled, painted an uneven picture. Some areas were checked multiple times by different groups, while others were only skimmed or left untouched, due to being deemed less likely relevant. The lack of a centralized control mechanism made assessing coverage gaps difficult, as it was not always possible to precisely determine which places had been thoroughly checked and which had only been glanced at. Investigators had to rely on overlaps or absences in reports to infer potential gaps, while weighing whether those gaps were important enough to remobilize forces. In that context, The widespread search gradually revealed two opposing sides. On one hand, a powerful collective effort demonstrating the community's concern and determination in searching for a missing child. On the other, a clear exposure of methodological limits when facing a case with no signs of violence, no decisive witnesses, and no strong physical evidence to guide action. The found items, though carefully examined, did not connect into a logical chain pointing to a specific direction of movement, but existed as scattered points that could be interpreted in multiple ways, depending on the prior hypothesis. Assessing coverage gaps thus became not just a geographical question, but one of timing and recognition, whether Henry had left the search area before the sweep was fully deployed, or whether a critical moment had occurred in a place no one thought to look. The widespread search, with all it achieved and failed to achieve, ended without providing a definitive answer, leaving behind a map full of marks of effort, but lacking a clear direction, and those very gaps became the foundation for the feeling that even though everyone had gone everywhere possible, something important had still been left out of sight, keeping the question of how Henry Porter disappeared hanging even after key areas had been searched nearly exhaustively. The fact that the widespread search yielded no decisive discovery forced the investigation's focus back to human data sources, where witness statements became the primary material for continuing to build remaining possibilities about what happened to Henry Porter. Police began systematizing the multi-source statement collection process, not limited to those already contacted in the early days, but extending to anyone who might have seen Henry in the suspected time frame, including those who had not come forward earlier because they thought their information was unimportant or uncertain. Interviews were conducted again, sometimes multiple times with the same person, to clarify details briefly mentioned in the initial chaotic context, with the goal of separating what witnesses actually saw from what they inferred or heard from others. However, as the number of statements increased, consistency did not improve but declined, as each account carried its own version of timing, location, and circumstances, making the overall picture more overlapping and harder to resolve. Some witnesses claimed to have seen Henry walking alone, looking normal. Others recalled him seemingly talking to an adult, while some were only certain they saw a boy resembling Henry, but could not confirm due to distance, or because memory had been diluted by stories circulating in the community. Conflicts between accounts lay not only in minor details, but in core elements like time and direction of movement, with time markers differing enough to create entirely different routes if plotted on a map. Investigators faced the reality that human memory, especially of an event not perceived as significant at the time, tends to be restructured over time, influenced by new information emerging later, from local press to community conversations. In that context, determining which statements were reliable became a major challenge, as there were no strong objective criteria to distinguish accurate memory from unconsciously adjusted memory. Alongside direct statements, sightings reports of Henry began appearing from various sources, ranging from nearby areas to farther locations, each with varying levels of detail, and often relayed to police with the belief that any information could be the key. Some reports described a boy resembling Henry in public places like stores, bus stops, or crowded areas, while others were more speculative, based on seeing a child with an adult who did not look like family. Processing these reports consumed considerable time and resources, as each had to be minimally verified to rule out missing a real lead, but verification often led to dead ends when identity could not be confirmed, or when the cited subject was found not to be Henry. Difficulties in verification stemmed not only from inaccurate information, but from time delays, as many reports arrived hours or days after the alleged event, making backtracking nearly impossible without objective records like images or travel logs. Meanwhile, public pressure began mounting as Henry's disappearance became a widely discussed topic in the community, creating an environment where every observation risked being exaggerated or interpreted to fit the circulating narrative. Public attention, though stemming from a desire to help, inadvertently created a wave of noise information, as residents began viewing every boy of similar age through the lens of the disappearance, leading to increased reports but decreased average quality. Investigators had to continually adjust information intake strategies, encouraging reports while trying to filter to avoid the investigation being pulled in unfounded directions. This pressure also directly affected initial witnesses, as they were approached multiple times and faced expectations that their statements must mean something, causing some to inadvertently add details or adjust memories to meet those expectations. Amid accumulating conflicting information, police had to choose between pursuing each report individually or returning to overall analysis to find rare intersections among statements, but both paths carried risks. Pursuing individually could scatter resources, while focusing on the whole could cause a small but important lead to be overlooked. The process of collecting and cross-referencing statements thus became a difficult balancing act between openness and control, where each decision directly affected the investigation's pace and direction. Prolonged conflicts in information not only slowed the search for Henry, but began eroding family and community confidence in finding answers soon, as each passing day brought new hopes ignited then quickly extinguished by unsuccessful verifications. In that state, statements and reports, instead of converging into a clear direction, formed a tangled web of uneliminated possibilities, forcing investigators to acknowledge that relying on witnesses, though unavoidable, was simultaneously the source of growing uncertainty. As the more people questioned, the more fragmented the picture of the day Henry disappeared became, and that very fragmentation became one of the biggest obstacles preventing the investigation from getting closer to a consistent resolution. The overlaps and conflicts in statements meant the investigative team could no longer process information in a fragmented way, forcing them to systematize all collected data into main investigative hypotheses to create a clear analytical framework for comparison, elimination, and resource allocation. The first hypothesis, also the most familiar in the 1955 Illinois social context, was that Henry might have wandered off on his own, or met with an accident during his travel, based on him being known to often travel alone, and the surrounding area having terrain potentially dangerous for children, such as major roads, vacant lots, or sparsely trafficked spaces. Proponents of this hypothesis pointed out that the lack of signs of coercion, violence, or disturbance at the last cited point fit a scenario where Henry turned in a different direction on his own, got lost, or encountered an incident preventing return, with the prolonged absence explained by him going too far, or ending up in a situation the community search had not reached. However, when cross-checked against actual data, issues emerged, as areas considered dangerous had been swept to a considerable degree in the widespread search without convincing traces found, and Henry's daily habits showed he had good orientation on familiar routes, reducing the likelihood of completely random wandering in a short time. The second hypothesis focused on the possibility that Henry was led away by someone without clear violence, based on some statements suggesting he might have interacted with an adult in the critical time, along with the observation that children in that era's community were often taught to be polite and obey adults. Under this hypothesis, Henry's deviation from his usual route could occur in a seemingly harmless context, such as being asked for small help, offered directions, or promised an activity appealing to children, causing him to go willingly without drawing attention. This hypothesis had the advantage of explaining the lack of coercion signs and why some witnesses vaguely recalled Henry standing next to an adult who looked normal, but its weakness lay in the lack of specific evidence to identify that person, the direction after leaving the last cited area, or the purpose of leading Henry away. The third hypothesis, also the most serious, raised the possibility that Henry was abducted with intent, a scenario less accepted in the 1950s due to limited societal awareness of such crimes and their usual association with clear violence signs. Opponents of the abduction hypothesis argued there was no direct evidence of coercion, no witnesses hearing cries for help, and no physical traces at the scene indicating a struggle, making prioritization of this scenario seem overreactive given the facts. Conversely, some investigators pointed out that the very absence of violent signs made a quiet abduction hypothesis worth considering, especially in a familiar community where children easily trusted adults, allowing deft leading to occur quickly without clear traces. Comparing evidence across hypotheses involved weighing each known fact, from the reconstructed timeline, witness statements, field search results, to Henry's personal characteristics, to see which hypothesis explained the most elements with the fewest conflicts. The wandering or accident hypothesis explained the lack of coercion, but struggled to account for no traces found after a large-scale search, while the led-away hypothesis better explained the quick and quiet disappearance, but lacked anchors for next investigative steps. The abduction hypothesis, though theoretically covering the most possibilities, required accepting that a serious crime occurred in a community considered safe, something both investigators and public opinion of the time struggled to accept without clear evidence. In the weighing process, contextual social factors and era-specific case handling experience played a significant role, as prior child disappearances in the area mostly ended with the child returning on their own, or being found relatively nearby, creating a psychological precedent favoring common hypotheses over rare but dangerous scenarios. Decisions on investigative prioritization thus relied not only on pure evidence analysis, but were influenced by expectations that this case would follow familiar patterns, an expectation gradually leading to focusing resources on less complex hypotheses seemingly easier to verify short-term. The consequence was that the abduction hypothesis, though not fully eliminated, was not placed centrally in the investigative strategy, limiting actions to seek signs of intentional intervention in scope and intensity. Meanwhile, wandering or led-away hypotheses continued to dominate, leading to investigation focusing on sweeping nearby areas and pursuing sightings reports, rather than expanding to scenarios requiring broader coordination or different approaches. This misprioritization was not the result of a single decision, but the convergence of multiple factors: incomplete data, time pressure, past experience, and social context, all combining to shape how the investigation proceeded in the critical phase. As hypotheses were ranked by priority this way, the case's direction gradually solidified, and less attended possibilities began drifting to the margins, not because they were disproven by evidence, but because they did not fit the widely accepted explanatory mold at the time. A strategic choice that also carried the risk of missing the truth if initial assumptions did not reflect the true nature of what happened to Henry Porter. Prioritizing investigative hypotheses created a certain inertia in how the authorities approached the case, and that inertia gradually led the investigation away from the core initial questions, pursuing leads that appeared more concrete but lacked a solid foundation. The focus shifted to chasing weak leads, most of which stemmed from reports of sightings of Henry at various locations, each report treated as a possibility requiring verification despite low credibility, due to the prevailing mindset that overlooking even a minor piece of information could lead to serious mistakes. Investigators spent time traveling, interviewing, and verifying cases that from the outset contained many uncertain elements, such as vague physical descriptions, mismatched timelines, or geographical distances difficult to explain within the time frame of Henry's disappearance. Handling each lead individually created the illusion that the investigation was progressing, but in reality, it fragmented the overall picture, as each new direction required separate resources without yielding data strong enough to reinforce or eliminate major hypotheses. Parallel to pursuing weak leads, the scope of the investigation gradually expanded beyond the initial core area, not because of clear evidence that Henry had left that area, but because the lack of results in the nearby zone made expansion a psychologically reasonable choice. More distant locations were added to the checklist based on scattered reports or speculation that if Henry had been taken, or had gone far on his own, he could have appeared anywhere with foot traffic, and this expansion quickly exceeded the local investigative force's control capacity. Each territorial expansion meant dividing personnel, prolonging response times, and reducing detail in processing each lead, as there were no longer enough resources to closely follow all directions simultaneously. Resource dispersion became evident when the same investigative team had to alternately handle multiple unrelated leads, causing tracking of each direction's progress to become interrupted and difficult to evaluate effectiveness. Initial investigators familiar with Henry's file began spending time on other tasks, while newcomers receiving information only grasped part of the context, leading to subsequent decisions based on incomplete understanding of the entire chain of events. The lack of a strong coordination center to continuously evaluate and adjust strategy caused the investigation to operate on the inertia of individual leads rather than a regularly updated overall plan. In that context, areas and hypotheses needing deeper exploration did not receive proportionate attention, as they did not generate immediate specific actions, while weak leads, despite low value, had the advantage of offering clear tasks: go to a location, meet a witness, verify a report. The feeling of doing something became a key factor in maintaining investigative momentum, even when those actions did not bring the case closer to resolution. As time passed without significant new progress, investigative reports began repeating old conclusions in different forms, and initial data was re-examined without uncovering any previously unrecorded aspects. The absence of new results gradually eroded internal confidence in resolving the case in the short term, while making it harder to request additional resources or maintain high priority in a system always balancing multiple cases. Consecutive verification efforts ending in dead ends created a cumulative chain of disappointment, not manifesting as a clear moment of failure, but spreading gradually through small decisions, delays, and reports yielding no new information. Investigative effectiveness declined not due to lack of goodwill or effort, but because the investigation structure had been pulled off course from central questions, causing actions to no longer be guided by clear strategic objectives. When weak leads continued to be prioritized due to pressure to act, while directions requiring deep analysis and broad coordination were delayed for lack of immediate basis, the investigation fell into a self-sustaining state, without self-correction, where each next step was decided more by the inertia of the previous one than by comprehensive reassessment of the situation. In that context, the lack of new progress was not only a result of insufficient evidence, but also a consequence of an accumulated series of strategic choices, each reasonable at the time, but collectively leading to dispersed resources, blurred focus, and significantly reduced ability to uncover the truth. The investigation, which began with urgency and expectations of finding Henry soon, gradually shifted to a minimal maintenance state, where actions were performed mainly to prove that all possibilities had been considered, rather than to truly discover something new. This decline in effectiveness did not occur suddenly, but accumulated through cycles of pursuing fruitless leads, territorial expansions unsupported by specific evidence, and decisions to divide rather than concentrate resources, creating a prolonged investigative phase lacking breakthroughs, in which Henry Porter remained a name in an active file, but the distance between investigating and finding the real answer grew ever more remote. The prolonged state of declining investigative effectiveness ultimately forced authorities to confront the reality that all active investigative measures within the current framework had nearly been exhausted, without yielding a new direction strong enough to maintain the initial priority level. Internal meetings gradually shifted focus from seeking leads to reassessing resource allocation, amid continually emerging other cases requiring immediate intervention, causing the Henry Porter file, though unresolved, to lose its central position in the investigative unit's workload. The decision to halt active investigation was not made as an official announcement closing the case, but occurred through a series of small yet impactful adjustments. New verifications were restricted, dedicated work hours were reduced, and pursuing new reports was done only minimally, to rule out clearly unrelated cases. Along with this, the case file was transferred to inactive status per internal procedures, meaning it was no longer handled as an ongoing matter, but became a waiting file, reopened only if new information strong enough to change the situation emerged. This status change did not remove the Henry Porter file from the system, but it completely altered how it was approached, from a case requiring continuous action to a set of archived documents for reference, where every detail was preserved, but no longer part of active investigative flow. Related documents, from interview transcripts, search reports, maps marking scanned areas, to internal notes on hypotheses and evaluations, were organized, packaged and placed in storage, reflecting how the system of that era prioritized physical file preservation over flexible retrieval and analysis. This data archiving process, though necessary to prevent information loss, simultaneously created a significant gap between the file and those who had directly participated in the investigation, as when investigators transferred, retired, or were reassigned, tacit knowledge and unfully documented inferences gradually vanished with them. In inactive status, the Henry Porter file existed as a set of papers recording an incomplete series of efforts, where leads were listed but no longer connected, and hypotheses noted but not fully tested with new methods. The failure to identify a suspect became the file's most prominent feature, as throughout the active investigation, no individual was deemed qualified for in-depth interrogation or official suspicion, leaving the case without a personnel focus to revolve around. The absence of a suspect not only limited tracing ability, but also affected how the case was perceived in the system, as cases without specific subjects often struggled to sustain long-term attention and priority. Simultaneously, failing to reach any conclusion about Henry's fate left the file in a suspended state, unable to close but also unable to advance, a characteristic of prolonged missing persons cases that the legal and investigative system of the time lacked effective tools to handle. The Porter family, though not informed of an official termination decision, gradually noticed a change in pace and interaction level from police, as contacts became infrequent and no longer carried specific updates. Meanwhile, administratively, the Henry Porter file was labeled as an unsolved case without viable investigative direction, a classification acknowledging that all measures possible at the time had been applied. This transition marked the case officially entering the space of dust-covered files, kept not for progress, but because they could not be fully discarded. The lack of a suspect, conclusion, and new evidence caused the file to exist as an open question in storage, ready to be retrieved if one day an external factor strong enough broke this stasis. At that time, however, there were no signs that would happen, and Henry Porter's disappearance, once the focus of collective concern and effort, was gradually placed among unresolved cases that the system had to accept as part of investigative limitations in the social and technological context of the 1950s. While the Henry Porter file was placed in stasis in the investigative agency's storage, the boy's life did not stop but continued in another place, completely separated from Illinois, and from all traces of the name attached to him for the first 11 years. The child growing up outside Illinois carried no systematic memories of the Porter family or the community of his birth, entering a new living environment with entirely different rules, daily rhythms and relationships, where his presence was taken as obvious rather than a question needing an answer. The new identity was given to him from the start in the new place, not as a conscious replacement, but as a naturally accepted reality, with a name, birth date, and family background matching accompanying documents, forming the legal and social foundation for his entire subsequent upbringing. In that upbringing, the boy was cared for, educated, and shaped in ways those around him considered normal, with school, friends, and social relationships built on the assumption that his past held nothing requiring questioning. Stories about origins, if mentioned, existed only vaguely, enough to satisfy a child's curiosity, but not detailed enough to trigger doubt, and that very vagueness became a familiar part of his self-perception. Not knowing the past did not mean having no past, but living in a present constructed from what was told and recorded, where the early years in Illinois were replaced by a new chain of memories formed in the current environment. As he grew, the boy adapted to the new identity as most children do, accepting the assigned role in family and community, learning to behave according to expectations without basis for comparison to another possible life. Memory gaps, if any, were not clearly recognized as they did not stand out from common human experience. Many people also lack clear recall of very early childhood, and thus the absence of specific images from early life was not seen as abnormal. However, on a deeper level, these gaps persisted as hazy areas in awareness, where feelings about origins did not fully align with what was recounted, yet not strong enough to prompt conscious inquiry. The upbringing, though providing surface stability, also shaped how the boy understood attachment and family, as all bonds were built on the present rather than long-term personal memory continuity. As he matured, the new identity became not just a name on paper, but a core part of who he was, influencing how others saw him and how he saw himself, making questioning the past unnecessary in most life situations. This different life developed on its own trajectory, with choices, successes, and failures unrelated to Illinois or the Porter family, each step of growth increasing the distance from the true origins he was unaware of. Fragmented memories, if they existed, appeared only as inexplicable familiar feelings before an image, scent, or setting, but were quickly dismissed by reason as coincidence or imagination, lacking any reference frame to connect them to a specific story. In the new environment, he was encouraged to look forward rather than dig into the past, further reinforcing acceptance of the current identity as unquestionable. Not knowing the past was not an active concealment or denial, but a natural consequence of being raised in a system where origin information was pre-shaped and showed no clear daily contradictions. Memory gaps thus were not felt as specific loss, but as an undefined part of self, only becoming noticeable when something external shook the integrity of the life story he had lived for years. Throughout that time, Henry Porter's different life proceeded parallel to the cold file bearing his name and storage, two existences never intersecting, one side motionless papers recording absence, the other a living person growing, adapting, unaware that his identity had once been the focus of a desperate search, and then left behind by time. Life formed under the new identity continued to develop along a stable trajectory, where the process of maturation occurred step by step without any clear disruptions, as all important milestones were built on legal documents and relationships recognized within the current living environment. The child grew up in the adoptive family with a clearly defined role, absorbing values, habits, and expectations similar to those of other children in the same community, where attachment was created not from perceived blood ties, but from daily care and shared experiences extending over many years. The adoptive family played a central role in shaping personality and the sense of belonging, providing a stable framework for development in academic, social, and emotional aspects, while creating an invisible barrier separating him from questions about origins that were not encouraged to be explored deeply. In personal life, the new identity became the foundation for all interactions, from school to work, from friendships to long-term choices, and there was no practical reason to doubt its validity when all administrative procedures matched and everyone around acknowledged it. The lack of contact with Illinois was not a conscious decision to sever the past, but a natural consequence of having no connecting threads in terms of memory, information, or social relationships leading back there, making Illinois exist only as a distant place name unlinked to the personal story. The stable personal records served as a solid frame enveloping this life, with the birth certificate, academic records, medical records, and other legal documents forming a continuous chain without breaks, sufficient to pass any routine administrative checks without revealing anomalies. During the maturation process, he adapted to different life stages in familiar ways, advancing through school levels, choosing a career, building personal relationships, and gradually shaping a personal identity based on current experiences rather than a deeper history. The adoptive family, by providing a consistent origin story, even if not detailed, helped maintain psychological stability, making questions about the past unnecessary in a context where everything was running smoothly. Personal life was built on present goals and responsibilities, from education and work to caring for close relationships, and each step forward reinforced the belief that the current identity was sufficient and complete. The absence of contact with Illinois also meant no stimuli from the old environment to trigger latent memories, making any vague feelings about origins easily overlooked or explained by other common reasons. The stable personal records not only enabled smooth legal functioning, but also created a sense of security, as in modern society, the consistency of documents is often considered strong enough evidence for a person's authenticity. This very stability reduced the likelihood of detecting minor discrepancies, as there were no clear conflicts between lived experiences and official information to force the individual or those around him to question it. As maturation stages followed one another, the new identity was not just an administrative shell, but became the core of how he understood himself, with memories, relationships, and responsibilities all tightly attached to it. The adoptive family, even if not perfect, remained the main anchor for the sense of belonging, and that attachment was strong enough to cover any unnamed gaps in memory. Life under a different identity thus did not bear the appearance of tense concealment or a provisional existence, but was a normal flow of life, where all elements necessary to form a person were fully provided, from education to social relationships, from responsibilities to rights. Only when viewed from the outside could one recognize that this stability was built on a foundation not entirely matching historical truth, but throughout that maturation process, nothing was strong enough to break the continuity of the life story being lived, making the different identity the only reality that individual knew and accepted as his own. The long-lasting stability of life under a different identity did not mean that every element in the personal records was completely seamless. Rather, the anomalies existed at a level small enough not to cause direct interruptions to daily life, but consistent enough to form a vague underlying layer if examined systematically. The birth certificate was the first point in that chain, not because it was clearly falsified, but because it lacked details commonly seen in records from the same period, with information about place of birth, attending personnel, or medical facility recorded at a minimal level, without accompanying supporting data, typically used for cross-verification when needed. Over many years, this incompleteness caused no significant obstacles, as administrative procedures mainly relied on the existence and acceptance of documents rather than deep scrutiny of each information item's origin, allowing the birth certificate to continue serving as a valid foundation for other papers. The medical records that followed shared similar characteristics, with gaps in the newborn and early childhood periods, where typically recorded data was incomplete or non-existent, creating a break in healthcare history without clear explanation. Later doctors and medical facilities often relied on provided information or accounts from the adoptive family, and in the absence of concerning medical signs, deep inquiry into past medical history was not deemed necessary. Contradictory information began appearing sporadically when different records were placed side by side, such as minor differences between dates recorded in documents and oral stories about the time he joined the adoptive family, or details not fully matching about the initial adoption context, but these contradictions were often dismissed as administrative errors or harmless memory lapses. Unclear origins became a foundational feature of this identity, not as an intentionally concealed secret, but as a story told vaguely enough not to trigger deep curiosity, especially in a social environment where asking too many questions about a child's past was considered impolite. Vague answers about initial circumstances, repeated over years, gradually became accepted as part of the family narrative, making further inquiry unnecessary for both the individual and those around him. In daily life, these abnormal signs did not converge strongly enough to form a specific issue needing resolution, as each individual sign could be explained by reasonable factors in the era and adoption context, from incomplete record keeping to changes in administrative recording practices over the years. Unasked questions arose not from lack of curiosity, but from no real situation, forcing them to be asked, when all legal and social needs were fully met by the existing document system. The absence of a collision moment between paper identity and lived experience kept the anomalies in a gray area where they were not large enough to be seen as serious errors, but not clear enough to be considered entirely harmless. The adoptive family, in its role of protecting current life stability, tended to avoid delving into details that could disrupt the shared story, especially when no signs indicated it would bring practical benefits. In that environment, the individual bearing this identity learned to accept incomplete answers as a natural part of life, as many people grew up with family stories that were incomplete or disrupted by war, migration, or social upheavals. These signs of abnormal personal identity thus were not connected into a logical chain, but existed scattered across different record compartments, each valid on its own, but creating a sense of inconsistency if viewed holistically. The lack of a strong enough triggering agent, such as strict legal verification, or a personal event forcing origin tracing, allowed the entire system to continue operating unchallenged. The outward smoothness of life, under a different identity, obscured these foundational anomalies, as in modern society, validity is often measured by documents' functionality, rather than absolute completeness of internal information. Questions about origins, if fleetingly appearing in thought, were quickly set aside by the pace of life and current responsibilities, leaving memory and record gaps existing in parallel without intersecting. Only when examined systematically could one recognize that these signs of abnormal personal identity, though not causing immediate disruption, had quietly accumulated over years, like small cracks in a seemingly solid structure, ready to surface when an external factor strong enough forced the long unasked question into the light. The quietly existing signs of abnormal personal identity, in the records, did not create any clear turning point, as life entered the adult phase, as major life choices continued to be made, based on the identity that had been accepted and functioned stably for many years. Building a separate family proceeded in the familiar rhythm of social life, with marriage, children, and extended family relationships formed, based on the present rather than the past, where roles as father, husband, or member of a new family were defined by daily responsibilities and attachment. Career was chosen and developed based on opportunities, personal abilities, and economic circumstances, unaffected by any questions about origins, as necessary documents for education, employment, and advancement were complete, and encountered no obstacles in verification. Career transitions, from initial jobs to more stable positions, reinforced the feeling that the life path being followed was valid, and there was no reason to doubt one's legal or social foundation. Relocations occurred according to work or family needs, possibly moving between states or different cities, but never toward Illinois, not due to a conscious avoidance decision, but because no personal connections, memories, or obligations tied to that location existed. Each relocation was a re-establishment of life in a new environment, where the current identity continued to be recognized without facing questions or challenges from administrative systems or surrounding communities. Throughout that process, no clear identity doubt emerged, as the anomalous pieces in personal records were not sufficient to connect into a different story, and all lived experiences aligned with what was recorded on paper. Normal life was maintained through familiar rhythms of work, family, and social relationships, where daily concerns fully occupied attention and left little space for delving into abstract questions about origins. In the role of an adult, responsibilities toward one's own family and professional obligations became top priorities, making looking back at distant past unnecessary when the present demanded constant focus. Social relationships were built on current trust and acquaintance, with no point requiring comparison to a personal history longer than what had been told and accepted. Childhood stories, if mentioned in conversations, were generally summarized and fit the overall picture of the life lived, containing no specific details to highlight the absence of early years in Illinois. The lack of identity doubt was not intentional avoidance, but the natural result of a smoothly operating system, where every societal interaction confirmed the validity of the current person, from signing employment contracts to fulfilling civic duties. That normal life continued over many years, marked by familiar milestones like career stability, children's growth, and expansion of family relationships, all reinforcing the sense that the life story being lived was complete and needed no supplementation. Even when major changes occurred, such as job changes, moves, or facing personal difficulties, they were handled within the framework of the current identity, without prompting a need to trace origins deeper. Moving between different communities further diluted the possibility of forming long-lasting connections enough for someone to question the past, as each new environment accepted the present person based on what was presented at the time. The separate family, with its own concerns, also had no reason to delve into details not directly affecting shared life, especially when current stability and security were prioritized over pursuing unclear information from the past. In that context, adult life developed as a logical sequence of connected events, where each decision was made based on the lived reality, and all elements necessary to maintain a normal life were available. This prolonged normality blurred the ability to recognize foundational anomalies, as when a person can live, work, and build a family without any obstacles from their identity, the need to question that identity's authenticity virtually does not exist. Adult life thus bore no signs of a concealed secret, but was the result of a chain of valid circumstances following one another, where the unknown past was not a worrisome gap, but an unnoticed part in a normally functioning, stable life fitting all societal expectations placed on an adult. A normal life spanning many decades does not create an intrinsic motivation to trace back origins, but changes in social context and technology gradually open up new options, making access to information about oneself easier and more common, in which DNA genealogy testing emerges as a personal tool, but one capable of profoundly impacting perceptions of identity. The decision to take a DNA test does not stem from any specific doubt about the past, but from a curiosity characteristic of the era, where exploring ancestors, geographic origins, and genetic connections is seen as a way to supplement an already stable family narrative. The process of collecting a sample and sending it off is simple, not tied to any expectations beyond general information about European origins or distant family branches, and thus the initial results are approached with an open but unguarded mindset. However, as the genealogical data is analyzed and compared against large databases, anomalous results begin to appear in the form of genetic connections that do not align with the origin story accepted throughout one's life. Instead of confirming familiar family branches or recounted geographic regions, the genealogical results point to closer than expected relationships with individuals bearing the surname Porter, a name that has never appeared in the known family history. This discovery is not immediately conclusive, but sufficient to create a discrepancy between the objective genetic data and the current identity based on documents and transmitted memories. The discovery of the Porter surname connection does not come with a clear story or a pre-established relationship, but exists as a set of genetic matches close enough to rule out coincidence, forcing the recipient to confront the question of how these connections came to be. When comparing the DNA results with existing family information, the mismatch becomes increasingly clear, as no branch in the known family tree can reasonably explain the appearance of the Porter surname at the indicated genetic level. The mismatch with the current identity does not manifest as a single discrepancy, but as a series of small accumulating contradictions, where each comparison further reduces the possibility of explanation through simple assumptions like data errors or technical mistakes. The difference between what documents and family stories affirm and what the DNA reveals creates a new cognitive gap, where for the first time the question of origins is no longer an abstract concept, but a specific issue requiring explanation. The newly formed question is not accusatory or conclusive, but revolves around how an individual can carry the genetic imprint of a family, completely unfamiliar to the life lived, and what that says about the early years that memory no longer retains. Approaching the DNA genealogy results does not immediately lead to external investigation or verification, but first creates an internal dialogue process, where possibilities are weighed within the scope of what is known: adoption, record errors, or some event in the past where information was severed. These assumptions, when placed alongside previously existing but unnoticed anomalies in identity records, begin to form a more logical chain of connections, though still not enough to reach a conclusion. The fact that the genealogical results point to specific connections rather than a vague picture of origins gives the DNA data particular weight, as it is not based on memory or oral accounts, but on biological markers that are difficult to dismiss with ordinary reasoning. The presence of the Porter surname in the genetic data must be explained by a real scenario, even if that scenario is unknown, and the very requirement to find a reasonable explanation changes the view of an identity previously considered stable. The mismatch with the current identity does not immediately collapse the existing life, but it creates a crack in the personal narrative, where previously accepted answers become insufficient to explain the new data. The newly formed questions therefore point not only outward, but also inward, toward re-evaluating assumptions built over many years, from family origins to how legal documents have shaped the life. In the context of increasingly widespread DNA genealogy technology, genetic data conflicting with identity records can no longer be easily ignored, as it opens the possibility of connecting to stories never known and records that may have been forgotten. However, at this stage, everything remains at the level of questions, because DNA data, though powerful, still needs to be placed in a specific context to become an answer, and the distance between an anomalous genealogical discovery and understanding the full truth about personal origins remains very large. The most important change does not lie in having an immediate answer or not, but in the fact that from this point onward, the current identity is no longer viewed as the only possible story, and the fragments once scattered in records and memories begin to be seen as signs that could connect to each other. DNA genealogy, from a tool of personal curiosity, becomes the starting point for a new process of awareness, where the question of who one is can no longer be answered solely by documents and habits of living, but requires confronting biological data, showing that the life story may be far more complex and fragmented than what was believed throughout the process of growing up. The new questions arising from DNA genealogy results cannot be resolved within the personal sphere, because the genetic data, though clearly indicating a connection to the Porter family, still needs to be placed in the context of official records to determine whether that match has historical significance or is merely a rare coincidence. Contacting the authorities occurs as a cautious step to seek objective answers, beginning with providing the DNA results to units authorized to handle genealogical data and missing persons records, where biological information can be compared against long-standing case files in the system. The receiving agency must initially assess the validity of the data, verifying the testing source, analysis methods, and accuracy of the genetic matches, to rule out possibilities of technical errors or misinterpretation of results. Once the data is confirmed as reliable, the process of comparing DNA to missing persons records begins at an exploratory level, focusing on searching for cases of missing children with age, timing, and context matching the indicated genetic connections. Old records, many of which have been archived for decades, are reviewed according to new criteria, where DNA genealogy becomes a filtering tool, rather than relying solely on physical descriptions or witness statements that have faded over time. In this process, the possibility of a match is not determined immediately, but is gradually narrowed through comparing foundational factors such as estimated year of birth, geographic areas related to Porter families, and unresolved missing persons cases. This narrowing helps reduce the search scope from hundreds of records to a few cases with real potential relevance, each analyzed individually to assess the degree of fit with the genetic data. Comparing DNA and records does not stop at finding a bloodline match, but also includes examining administrative and social factors attached to each case, from how the incident was initially recorded to the hypotheses previously pursued, and why they did not lead to conclusions. This process requires coordination between record-keeping units, DNA experts, and investigators experienced in cold cases, to ensure that new data is not forcibly imposed on old records, but integrated carefully. Assessing reliability becomes a key step, because a genetic match, no matter how strong, must be placed in historical and administrative context to avoid erroneous conclusions based solely on biological similarity. Experts must consider the closeness of the genetic relationship, the possibility of unrecorded family branches, and factors that could distort data, such as legal or informal adoptions in different historical periods. At the same time, missing persons records are examined from a new perspective, where details once undervalued or deemed unimportant in the initial investigation context may gain significance when illuminated by DNA data. The combination of modern biological information and historical records creates a new analytical space where old hypotheses can be re-evaluated without being bound by priority decisions made decades earlier. Narrowing the possibility of a match is not immediately affirmative, but akin to building a set of plausible scenarios, each requiring further verification through additional investigative methods. In that context, preparing to re-investigate does not mean immediately reopening a specific case, but is the process of building the necessary foundation so that if a decision is made, reopening the file will be based on solid data and clear objectives. Authorities must consider the legal, social and personal impacts of linking a living individual to a historical missing persons record, especially without a final conclusion, to avoid unwanted consequences from an unfully verified assumption. Connecting DNA to missing persons records thus proceeds with a high degree of caution, where each advance is carefully weighed to ensure that new data is used as a tool to clarify the truth, rather than as a factor adding further confusion to already complex records. This process marks an important shift in approaching the case, when files once lying dormant in archives are brought back under the light of modern technology, and the possibility of re-investigation, though not yet officially begun, has become a realistic option based on the rare convergence of biological data, administrative history, and questions left unanswered for many decades. The analytical foundation formed from connecting DNA to missing persons records creates the necessary conditions for an important decision to be made within the investigative system when the 1955 case is for the first time reconsidered, not as a static historical file, but as a cold case capable of being restructured with modern data. The cold case unit of the state of Illinois takes over the file in a lead role, assembling investigators specialized in cases spanning many decades, trained to work with old documents, incomplete data, and hypotheses once overlooked. The takeover is not merely an administrative transfer, but a process of re-establishing full access to all materials related to the disappearance of Henry Porter, including reports never reanalyzed since the file was moved to inactive status. Reviewing archived records becomes the first and most time-consuming step, as the documents exist in various forms, from handwritten reports, maps marking search areas, witness interview reports, to informal internal notes, all needing to be reread in a new context where DNA genealogy plays a central role. In the review process, Investigators do not search for a single breakthrough detail but strive to understand the logic of the original investigation, including how hypotheses were formed, why they were prioritized or discarded, and which points were not pursued to the end. Digitizing the documents is implemented in parallel to transform a bulky physical file into searchable, retrievable, and cross-referencable data, allowing modern investigators to identify connections that were previously hard to see when information was fragmented on paper. The digitization process not only aims to preserve documents, but also facilitates applying new analytical methods, from reorganizing timelines to cross-referencing witness statements according to more consistent criteria. As documents are entered into the digital system, old errors begin to emerge more clearly, not as obvious mistakes, but as logical gaps in how data was processed, such as certain important statements not being followed up, contradictory details overlooked rather than analyzed, or hypotheses excluded too early, based on socially contextual assumptions rather than evidence. Other errors relate to search scope and geographic zoning, when decisions to expand or narrow areas were not always based on consistent timeline analysis, but influenced by resource pressures and expectations that the case would follow familiar patterns. Discovering these errors is not aimed at assigning blame to previous investigators, but at understanding the limitations of the original investigation and determining what may have been missed in the context of the technology and awareness of that era. Based on the review and reevaluation of the entire file, the cold case unit begins adjusting the investigative direction, not by repeating old steps, but by reposing basic questions under the light of DNA data and modern understanding of child disappearance patterns. Hypotheses once considered low probability are brought back to the analysis table, especially scenarios involving movement away from the initial area without clear traces, and details once deemed too vague to act on are now examined as potential pieces in a larger picture. Adjusting the investigative direction also includes redefining realistic goals for the reopening process, when the focus is no longer on finding a suspect for criminal prosecution, but on clarifying the fate of Henry Porter and how he left Illinois, to resolve the identity question posed by the DNA data. Reopening the investigation thus is not merely retrospective, but a combination of looking back at the past and restructuring it with new tools and analytical frameworks, allowing files once blurred by time to return to a state where they can be actively interrogated. In this process, modern investigators must balance respecting the historical context of the file with not letting old assumptions continue to dominate how they read the data, a particular challenge when working with cases spanning many decades. The result of the reopening phase is not an immediate answer, but a new analytical foundation, where old pieces are rearranged according to a different logic, opening the possibility of approaching the truth in a way that the 1955 investigation, with all its efforts and limitations, never had the conditions to achieve. The reopening of the case in 1955, with DNA data at its core, propelled the investigation into a critical phase where every assumption had to yield to definitive analysis based on scientific evidence and historical logic. DNA analysis was expanded and repeated through multiple layers of comparison, not just matching once with one individual in the Porter family, but constructing an entire genetic genealogy map, precisely determining the biological position of the person living under a different identity within this family structure. Genetic experts used multiple independent markers to assess the closeness of blood relations, from gene similarity levels to statistical probabilities, ensuring that the results could not be explained as a rare coincidence or technical error. The data showed consistent compatibility with the role of a child born into the Porter family in the mid-1940s, with no deviation large enough to negate a direct relationship, and this established a solid biological foundation for the next confirmation step. However, DNA, though powerful, could not stand alone without the support of historical facts, so timeline and location cross-referencing was conducted in parallel to verify the overall reasonableness of the conclusion. Investigators re-examined the recorded birth year in Henry Porter's file, comparing it with biological age estimates from DNA and with timelines in the life recorded under the other identity, from the point of first appearance in administrative systems to periods without clear data. Gaps in personal records, previously seen as unusual but overlooked, were now placed correctly in the timeline, aligning with the period when Henry disappeared from Illinois and had no legal records of existing elsewhere. Geographical factors were also analyzed in detail, not just at the state or regional level, but at the level of practical feasibility for moving a child in the social and transportation context of 1955, ensuring that the scenario of Henry leaving Illinois and appearing elsewhere was historically plausible. When potential travel routes were mapped out, no unexplainable contradictions emerged between the DNA data and the real conditions of that era, further reinforcing the consistency of the emerging conclusion. To avoid conclusions being influenced by the desire to resolve the case after decades, the investigation team proactively conducted a systematic elimination of other possibilities that could lead to similar results. The hypothesis of legal adoption but incompletely recorded was examined by reviewing adoption records from the relevant period, cross-referencing with the timing and location of the other identity's appearance, and ruled out when no documents were found that could explain such a deep genetic match. The possibility of confusion with another missing child case from the same era was checked by comparing records of other similarly aged missing children, but none showed comparable DNA compatibility or timeline alignment. Hypotheses about undocumented Porter family branches were also analyzed, yet expanding the family tree revealed no branch that could produce identical genetic results without leading back to Henry Porter. Each eliminated possibility narrowed the space for doubt, shifting the conclusion from very high probability to near absolute certainty. When biological, historical, and administrative analyses converged without internal contradictions, the Henry Porter identity conclusion was formed not as a hypothesis requiring further verification, but as a multi-layered confirmed reality. The individual living under the other identity was determined to be Henry Porter, the child missing since 1955, with matches not only in genes but in the entire logic of time, place, and records. Reaching this conclusion required a rigorous internal evaluation process, as confirming identity after 70 years was not just an investigative step, but an action with profound legal, social, and personal consequences. Involved agencies had to agree that all professional standards were met, that no counter-evidence remained unexamined, and that the conclusion was robust enough to withstand independent scrutiny, if necessary. Once consensus was reached, the step of notifying results was prepared with high caution, including determining the method, sequence, and scope of information shared, to ensure the truth was conveyed accurately and responsibly. The notification was not merely confirming an investigative finding, but an official act reconnecting two existences separated for decades: the frozen missing person file in archives, and a life that had developed independently under another identity. In that moment, the identity of Henry Porter was no longer just a name on paper or a scientific assumption, but a reality recognized by the modern investigative system. This confirmation was not seen as the end of the entire story, but as a pivotal milestone, where the case shifted from pursuit to acknowledgement, and where history was finally adjusted to reflect the truth obscured by the limitations of its era. Confirming Henry Porter's identity thus not only answered where the child missing in 1955 had gone, but also affirmed the ability of modern science to restore interrupted stories, showing that even records seemingly buried by time could be illuminated when biological, historical, and investigative pieces were reassembled carefully and systematically. Confirming Henry Porter's identity through DNA did not close the need for investigation, but instead opened a new line of inquiry. Focusing on the core unanswered question, how an 11-year-old child could leave Illinois in 1955 and disappear from all administrative systems for years without leaving clear traces. Analyzing the 1955 movement process became the first step in the reverse investigation, as investigators had to place themselves in the transportation, social and legal context of that era, where controls on identity, documents, and interstate movement were far looser than today. Road routes, railways, and public transport were examined, based on practical feasibility for a child to be taken out of the area without drawing attention, especially in a time when identity checks were virtually non-existent for minors. Investigators assessed the likelihood of Henry leaving Illinois via an adult's personal vehicle, by train, or through post-war labor migration networks, where people frequently moved between states with little oversight. There was no direct evidence of which route Henry used, but movement scenarios were evaluated based on reasonableness in terms of time, cost, and risk of detection, aiming to narrow possibilities rather than pinpoint a specific route no longer verifiable with data. In that context, the hypothesis of illegal adoption emerged as a serious possibility to consider, not as a legal adoption with incomplete records, but as an informal process outside legal frameworks, which was not uncommon in the 1950s when child protection systems were rudimentary. Investigators examined the possibility that Henry was taken away and then handed to another family under the guise of an orphan, abandoned child, or through unlicensed intermediaries operating in the gray area between charity and exploitation. This hypothesis explained why Henry could later have a new identity, with valid documents, but no clear adoption records directly linking back to Illinois, as many such transactions were unrecorded or deliberately obscured. Checking official adoption records from the relevant period yielded no direct results, reinforcing the likelihood that if adoption occurred, it was outside the system or through legal loopholes of the time. Those loopholes became a key part of the analysis, as 1955 was a period when birth registration, child origin verification, and oversight of interstate movements lacked uniformity across states, facilitating identity changes without the tight paper trail required later. Investigators reviewed legal regulations in Illinois and neighboring states from that era, finding no effective mechanisms to track children removed from the state without timely complaints or reports, and even when reported, information sharing between federal and local agencies remained fragmented. These very loopholes created space for scenarios where Henry could be legally documented elsewhere, while the Illinois missing person case remained a separate, unconnected file. However, the reverse investigation quickly reached the limits of criminal evidence, as most potential actions lay beyond direct tracing after 7 decades. There were no surviving witnesses able to provide reliable testimony about Henry's departure from Illinois, no transportation documents, no financial or administrative records detailed enough to identify involved individuals. Those potentially involved, if any, were most likely deceased, and even if alive, their memories could hardly serve as legal evidence after so much time. The lack of criminal evidence meant the investigation could not proceed to identifying personal responsibility or prosecution, forcing investigators to accept that this phase's goal was not criminal pursuit, but reconstructing the most reasonable scenario based on what could be known. Limited investigation became the default state, where each hypothesis was evaluated not to prove or disprove absolutely, but to determine its fit with confirmed data, from DNA to historical timelines. Investigators noted that while it was impossible to precisely determine who took Henry from Illinois, or how the process occurred, the combination of biological data, legal loopholes, and 1955 social context created a consistent framework, explaining how Henry could vanish from the system without clear criminal traces. This also highlighted the limitations of the era's investigative system, where child protection and identity tracking were not prioritized highly enough to prevent such cases. The reverse investigation thus did not provide a complete answer in the traditional criminal case sense, but offered deeper understanding of how Henry Porter's disappearance could realistically occur, based on the gaps and flaws of the time. Acknowledging investigative limits was not seen as failure, but as an honest reflection of what could be achieved when facing an event stretched too far from its origin by time. In this phase, the investigation's focus gradually shifted from seeking perpetrators to recognizing and clarifying the conditions that allowed a child to leave his community undetected in time, an approach not aimed at accusation but at better understanding the malfunctioning mechanisms. The reverse investigation of the departure from Illinois thus became the final step in restructuring the case's history, not delivering narrow criminal justice, but playing a crucial role in completing the full picture of Henry Porter's fate. From the moment of disappearance to identity confirmation, while highlighting systemic lessons about how legal and social loopholes could lead to consequences spanning generations. The reverse investigation illuminated how Henry Porter left Illinois and confirmed his identity after 7 decades. But it was at this point that the investigation had to confront head-on the rigid boundaries of the legal system, where not every uncovered truth can be transformed into criminal accountability. The status of suspects was the first and most decisive obstacle, as throughout the entire file review, no specific individual was identified as directly removing Henry from his family in 1955 in a way clear enough to become a criminal investigation target. Plausible hypotheses about who carried out the act, though logically possible, were not tied to a definite identity, and in many cases, potential individuals, if they existed, were deceased, making legal responsibility assignment impossible from the subject level. Even in a hypothetical scenario where a living individual could be named, the legal system would still face the next barrier, statute of limitations, as most actions related to the case, from taking a minor from the family, unlawful detention, to falsifying identity documents, had long exceeded the allowable prosecution timeframe under current criminal law. The statute of limitations is not a flexible technical detail, but a core legal principle ensuring procedural fairness, where evidence degrades over time, and the defendant's ability to defend themselves is no longer guaranteed after decades. In this context, applying modern laws to a 1955 event is impermissible, as criminal law does not operate retroactively, and any pursuit of responsibility must comply with the legal framework existing at the time of the suspected act. Lack of criminal evidence further reinforced this limitation, as while DNA science confirmed Henry Porter's identity, it provided no direct evidence of specific criminal acts, timing, or perpetrators. There was no preserved physical evidence, no transportation documents, no financial or administrative records indicating intentional intervention by a specific individual, and no remaining direct witnesses able to provide testimony reliable by criminal trial standards. What remained was mainly historical inference built from biological data, social context, and era-specific legal loopholes, sufficient to reconstruct a reasonable scenario, but insufficient to prove a specific charge beyond reasonable doubt. Inability to prosecute was thus not a compromise choice, but a mandatory legal conclusion, when minimum criminal procedure conditions were unmet, regardless of historical truth clarity. Prosecutors and investigators had to agree that pursuing a criminal case in this context would not only fail legally, but risk harming fairness principles, as an individual could be named, without the ability to defend against charges based on incomplete data. It was here that the distinction between resolution and justice became particularly important, as Henry Porter's case could be considered resolved at the truth level, with identity confirmed and the question of where the 1955 missing child went finally answered, but could not achieve justice in the traditional criminal justice sense. Justice within the legal framework requires not only truth, but also an accountable party, valid evidence, and timely procedures, elements this case could no longer provide after 70 years. This difference created an emotionally difficult-to-accept gap, especially for the family and those concerned with the case, as truth emerged into light without accompanying judgment or punishment for those causing decades-long separation. However, from a legal perspective, acknowledging inability to prosecute was a necessary honest act to avoid using the justice system symbolically rather than as a mechanism protecting fairness and rights for all parties. Henry Porter's case thus became an example of the reality that the legal system, though designed to seek and punish wrongdoing, has insurmountable limits when time has eroded evidence and involved parties. This does not diminish the value of identity confirmation or historical reconstruction, but it forces society to adjust expectations about what justice can deliver in multi-generational cold cases. Clearly distinguishing between resolving truth and achieving criminal justice helps avoid confusion that an unprosecuted case means complete system failure, when in reality, the system did the maximum within the bounds of law and evidence. In this case, justice manifested not in a trial but in official acknowledgement of the truth and restoration of identity to a person once silently stripped of it. Legal limitations thus were not just the stopping point of the criminal investigation, but a reminder of time's role in shaping accountability possibilities, and that not all historical wounds can be healed by legal tools. When the justice system must halt, what remains is recording the truth, preserving records, and drawing lessons to prevent similar tragedies in the future. A different form of justice, non-punitive, but with lasting social and historical value. The legal statute of limitations had closed the path to criminal prosecution, but it simultaneously opened a different process, one that was more human in nature, where the focus was no longer on the perpetrator or the sentence, but on the blood ties that had been severed for 7 decades. Verification of biological kinship was carried out as an indispensable step before any direct contact, to ensure that the reunion, if it took place, was built on a solid foundation and would not cause additional harm through mistaken identity or misplaced expectations. Additional DNA tests were conducted with multiple surviving members of the Porter family, not only to confirm direct lineage, but also to clarify Henry's position in the current family tree, as many generations had passed and the family structure was no longer the same as in 1955. The results reinforced what had already been confirmed earlier, creating scientific consensus on the bloodline and completely eliminating the possibility of error. But they also presented an unavoidable reality: those who now shared the same blood were strangers in terms of life experience. On that foundation, the necessary legal procedures were undertaken to adjust personal records, restore the original identity in the administrative system, and determine the scope of legal recognition of the family relationship, a complex process because it involved not only paperwork, but also long-term consequences regarding rights, obligations, and how society views a person who had lived nearly an entire life under a different name. Authorities had to consider carefully to ensure that updating the identity did not cause unnecessary disruption to the current life, while still respecting historical truth and Henry Porter's right to be properly recognized. Once the basic procedures were completed, the step of meeting relatives was prepared with a high degree of caution, not as a spontaneous emotional moment, but as a process that needed to be guided slowly to minimize psychological shock for all parties. The surviving relatives of the Porter family, most of whom knew Henry only through handed-down stories or missing person files, had to confront the reality that their long-lost relative was now a man who had lived his own separate life, with his own family, habits, and identity formed independently. The first meeting did not resemble a complete homecoming, but rather the intersection of two parallel histories meeting for the first time, where emotions were a mixture of relief at the confirmation of truth and confusion over the unbridgeable distance. The initial adaptation process was slow and uneven, as each side entered the relationship with different expectations shaped by memories, imagination, and years of waiting or complete unawareness. For the Porter family, Henry's survival brought closure to a pain that had spanned generations, but it also revived unanswered questions about what had been lost and what could never be regained. For Henry, being confirmed as part of his biological family did not automatically create a sense of belonging, because his identity and emotional bonds had been built elsewhere, in a life without Illinois, and without memories of the early years. Adaptation, therefore, was not simply getting acquainted with new relatives, but a process of redefining one's place in a larger story, where he was both the one found and the one who had lived a full separate life. The imperfect reality became evident when reunion moments could not fill the void of 70 years of separation, as there was no way to recreate the lost years or rebuild a traditional parent-child relationship when time had passed so far. The first conversations revolved around exchanging basic information, comparing similarities, and sharing indirect fragments of memory, but they also revealed the clear boundary between blood ties and emotional attachment, between biological truth and lived experience. The Porter family had to accept that Henry could not simply return like a lost child, while Henry had to face the fact that being found did not mean he could fully integrate into a family he had never lived with. The new relationships formed in this context were tentative and required time to establish boundaries, as both sides had to learn to respect the lives that had existed parallel to the blood connection now restored. The reunion, therefore, was not defined by a single moment, but by a series of small interactions, where each meeting, each call, and each sharing both carried the meaning of connection and served as a reminder of the unerasable distance. The imperfect reality was also evident in the fact that some relatives were no longer alive to witness this moment, making the reunion carry a sense of regret and loss alongside relief, as those who had waited the longest were no longer there to see the final outcome. In that context, the family reunion was not viewed as a simple happy ending, but as a belated adjustment of history, where truth was restored to its place, but could not erase the consequences of time. This process required patience, understanding, and acceptance that a relationship built on blood ties after 7 decades would be different in nature from those formed through living and growing up together. Nevertheless, the confirmation and meeting still held profound meaning, as it closed a state of suspension that had lasted generations, allowing both sides to place Henry Porter's story into a more complete frame, where the child missing since 1955 was no longer an open question, but a person with a life, choices, and the right to be acknowledged. The reunion, with all its limitations and complexities, thus became a milestone more humanitarian than legal, promising no complete healing, but providing the necessary acknowledgement, so that each side could continue their lives with a truth that had finally been properly named. The reunion closed a long chapter of silence and waiting, but did not immediately open a state of stability, because once the truth had been properly named, the parties involved had to learn to live with it in everyday life, where emotions were no longer driven by climax but by small, enduring interactions. After the initial meetings, the relationship between Henry Porter and his biological family entered a phase of reshaping, as both sides had to establish new boundaries to reconcile the recently restored blood ties with lives that had existed independently for decades. Henry continued to maintain the life he had built under his former identity, with his own family, personal responsibilities, and familiar routines, while the identity of Henry Porter was gradually integrated as part of his personal history, rather than a complete replacement for the current self. The Porter family, having overcome the initial shock of finding their lost relative, had to face the reality that Henry's presence in their lives could not unfold in the way they had imagined over years of speculation, as there was no shared past to serve as a foundation for immediate bonding. Subsequent contacts were exploratory, focused on getting to know each other rather than recreating traditional family roles, and this very slowness helped reduce the pressure to make a long-overdue reunion perfect. In Henry's personal life, the new truth did not disrupt the existing structure, but created a new layer of self-awareness, where the past was no longer a nameless void, but a specific story with places, people, and clear historical context. Accepting the parallel existence of two realities, one the life lived, the other the identity lost, became an ongoing psychological process with no clear endpoint, as each new situation raised questions about how the two parts could coexist. For the Porter family, the post-reunion period was also a time of re-evaluating collective memory, as stories about the child missing in 1955 were placed alongside the living person in the present, forcing them to adjust how they remembered the past so as not to harm the present. Memorial rituals maintained for many years gradually lost their old meaning, giving way to other forms of recognition, more suited to the truth that Henry was alive, even if not living with them. In that context, the reunion did not create a simple happy ending, but opened a new state of balance, where each side had to accept what could not be changed, and build relationships based on reality, rather than expectation. The post-reunion period also revealed emotional limits that could not be overcome, as some family members found it difficult to connect deeply with Henry, due to the time gap, while others strove for closeness as a way to compensate for the lost years. These differences did not lead to open conflict, but created a multifaceted picture of how people respond differently to the same truth. For Henry, being recognized as Henry Porter brought the feeling of being correctly named in history, but it did not entail a need to completely restructure his life, as his deepest attachments had been formed elsewhere and could not be replaced. Life after the reunion therefore continued in a parallel state, where the confirmed identity did not erase the lived identity, but existed as an additional layer of meaning, allowing the life story to be retold more fully, without denying the choices that had been made. The presence of media and public interest, if any, was also handled cautiously to avoid turning a personal story into a simplified symbol, as those involved understood that their truth was far more complex than a headline. Post-reunion, ultimately, was not the end of tragedy, or the beginning of an entirely new chapter, but a phase of stabilization after a personal historical event had been resolved, where life returned to its normal rhythm, but with a deeper awareness of what had happened. In that state, accepting the imperfect reality became the key factor, because only by acknowledging that lost time could not be regained, could the parties continue their lives without being trapped in endless comparisons between what happened and what might have been. Post-reunion therefore carried the meaning of continuation, rather than conclusion, where the truth had been established, but living with that truth remained an open process, gradually shaped through small choices and mutual respect in the present. The fragile stability after the reunion did not erase the remaining gaps in Henry Porter's story, but instead highlighted questions that had never been answered and might never receive complete resolution. Who took Henry away from Illinois in 1955 remains the central question, but without a definitive answer. As no individual was recorded, there was no direct testimony, and no physical evidence strong enough to point to a specific person responsible for the disappearance. The hypotheses raised during the retrospective investigation, from Henry being taken by a lone individual to the possibility of him being passed through multiple hands, remained only reasonable inferences based on the social and legal context of that era, unable to be confirmed by independent data. The question of whether a network existed further complicated the picture, as the 1950s was a period when informal child adoptions, poorly supervised charitable organizations, and intermediaries operating in legal gray areas still existed alongside the official system. The fact that Henry could disappear from Illinois and reappear elsewhere with a new identity, without leaving clear administrative traces, suggests that the process was unlikely to have occurred entirely by chance, but there was also no evidence strong enough to confirm the existence of an organized network behind it. Systemic responsibility thus became a larger and broader question than identifying a specific individual, as Henry's disappearance lasting 7 decades was not only the result of one or a few people's actions, but also a consequence of gaps in the child protection system, identity management, and information sharing among agencies at that time. The authorities in 1955 acted within the limits of knowledge and resources of the era, but those very limits created space for the disappearance to occur and persist without timely detection. The question is not raised to assign personal blame to those who participated in the initial investigation, but to recognize how procedures, priorities, and societal assumptions of the time contributed to shaping the outcome of the case. Henry being found after 70 years also forced a re-evaluation of similar cases that had been classified as cold cases and never reopened, raising the possibility that not every missing person case ends in death or voluntary disappearance, but may contain interrupted stories that remain unconnected due to lack of suitable tools. DNA genealogy, in this case, accomplished what traditional methods could not, but it also highlighted the dependence of truth on technology and timing, as a story could lie dormant for decades simply because the means to connect the pieces did not yet exist. This leads to the broader question of how many other cases still sit in archives with similar questions, and how many families still live in a state of not knowing what really happened. The limits of truth therefore lie not only in evidence or statutes of limitations, but also in human capacity to accept that some questions may never be fully answered, even when the core of the story has been clarified. The truth about Henry Porter's identity has been confirmed, but the truth about how he left his family, who was involved, and their motives remains beyond the reach of modern investigation, not due to lack of effort, but because time has erased the necessary traces. These unanswered questions exist alongside the confirmed truth, creating a picture that is incomplete, but more honest about the case, where acknowledging what cannot be known is as important as announcing what is known. In that context, the Henry Porter case becomes a reminder of the fragility of past child protection systems and how small decisions, unverified assumptions, and legal gaps can resonate to create consequences spanning generations. Raising these unanswered questions is not intended to rekindle pain or seek a perpetrator who cannot be prosecuted, but to fully record the complexity of the truth, avoiding simplification of a story formed from many layers of time, people, and different social contexts. These questions also serve as part of collective memory, reminding us that no matter how far science and investigation advance, limits that cannot be overcome still exist, and recognizing those limits helps the story be retold honestly and responsibly. Henry Porter's story, at this stage, is no longer a journey to find absolute answers, but an acceptance that truth sometimes exists in an imperfect form, where what is known and what will forever remain unknown together shape the ultimate meaning of a case that lasted 70 years. The unanswered questions remain as gaps that cannot be filled, but it is from those gaps that the entire 70-year trajectory of the Henry Porter case emerges with full historical depth, showing how a small event on an afternoon in 1955 spread into a chain of consequences spanning generations. From the moment Henry disappeared from Illinois, the case went through the familiar stages of a mid-20th century missing person file, an initial investigation based on the assumption of wandering off community searches with limited resources, the gradual fading of leads, and then the file being moved to inactive status when no viable direction remained. For decades, the name Henry Porter existed in archives as a symbol of absence, recorded but not connected to any living story about the child's actual fate. Only when DNA genealogy technology emerged and was applied to cold cases did the seemingly closed timeline reopen, allowing a connection between a life being lived and a long-dormant file. The role of DNA in resolving this case lay not in identifying a perpetrator or reconstructing criminal details, but in its ability to restore identity, returning the name and historical place to a person who had been separated from his own story. DNA genealogy became the bridge between objective biological data and outdated administrative records, overcoming limits that witness memory, paperwork, and traditional investigative methods could not surpass after decades. The Henry Porter case clearly illustrates that in cold cases, especially child disappearances, uncovering the truth does not necessarily follow the classic criminal path, but can come from interdisciplinary approaches where science, history, and investigation converge. From an investigative lesson perspective, the case highlights the importance of preserving records, even those that appear hopeless at the time, because the value of data can change as technology and analytical methods advance. The errors, assumptions, and limitations of the 1955 investigation are not viewed as personal failures, but as consequences of a system operating in a different social and legal context, emphasizing that investigations are always deeply influenced by the era in which they exist. At the same time, reopening files and digitizing documents shows that the way data is stored and organized can determine the ability to re-access truth in the future, turning seemingly inert paper files into living sources of information when placed in a new analytical framework. On a societal level, the significance of the case extends beyond one family or community, as it reflects how society once viewed and handled child disappearances, as well as how legal and administrative gaps could lead to consequences lasting decades. The Henry Porter story raises questions about collective responsibility in protecting children and managing identity, while showing that modern standards for supervision, information sharing, and child rights protection are not obvious, but the result of lessons drawn from cases like this. Henry being found after having lived most of his life also shows that truth, even when late, still has value, not only for those directly involved, but for collective memory, as it helps correct stories told for years, based on assumptions. Closing the file does not mean every aspect of the case is fully resolved, but is an official acknowledgement that the core questions have been answered within the limits allowed by the current system. The Henry Porter file was closed with the status of resolved regarding identity, but without criminal prosecution, reflecting a clear distinction between clarifying historical truth and enforcing criminal justice. This closure is more administrative and symbolic than emotional, as the consequences of the case continue to exist in the lives of those involved, in the form of memories, newly formed relationships, and how they understand their past. However, closing the file also marks an important milestone, where a 70-year case is no longer an open question in the system, but becomes a complete enough story to be recorded, studied, and learned from. In summary, the Henry Porter case is not a story of absolute justice triumphing, but a testament to human capacity to persistently seek truth, even when time and circumstances are unfavorable. It shows that in the field of cold cases, success is not measured only by prosecutions or sentences, but also by restoring identity, history, and voice to those lost in silence. The combination of modern science and historical records has opened a new path for approaching seemingly dead-end cases, while reminding us that every file, no matter how old, may contain a story not yet fully told. When the Henry Porter file was closed, what remained was not just an investigative conclusion, but a reminder of the value of preserving data, scientific progress, and never stopping asking questions, even when answers come later than expected. The case ends not with a verdict, but with acknowledgement, and that acknowledgement carries the longest-lasting meaning for the 70-year journey, to find the truth about a boy who once disappeared from Illinois, and was finally found when history had come full circle. The Henry Porter story reveals something very everyday in today's United States. Major tragedies often begin with a series of small choices in a society that believes its neighborhoods are safe. In 1955, Illinois still had the small-town familiar faces mindset. An 11-year-old could walk around alone. That very belief caused early signals to be downplayed, families to search instinctively before calling police, and authorities initially to favor the wandering off hypothesis over abduction. The practical lesson for American families today is to design proactive safety. Instead of relying on feelings, establish clear check-in rules for children, return times, routes, stops, teach children how to respond when strangers approach with help requests, and treat any unexplained time gap as a signal requiring early action. For adults, the lesson is to record details immediately, descriptions of strangers, vehicles, directions, because this story shows that later witness statements will conflict, memories will be distorted by public opinion, causing investigations to veer off course and files to become cold cases. At the community level, Henry Porter reminds us that records and data can save people decades later. The truth was only reopened when DNA genealogy connected the Porters to another identity. Therefore, in modern American life, treat preserving records, documents, photos, medical information, participating in community alert systems, and supporting cold case units as part of civic responsibility. Finally, a reunion after 70 years also teaches that being found does not mean complete. Approach the truth with compassion, respect the life the victim has lived, and accept the boundaries of justice when time has swept away the evidence. If the story of Henry Porter has made you reflect on the value of truth and what time can conceal, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue following other cold cases recently reclaimed from the past. Thank you for staying with us until the end of the story, and see you in the next video, where each case is not just a mystery, but a very real lesson about people and society.